Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, welcome back to the channel and I hope you've all been doing well. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the RTX 3080's ray tracing and DLSS performance, which we'll be comparing directly against to the RTX 2080 Super in the same test. These benchmarks will allow us to see how much performance has improved in these areas generation over generation. If you haven't seen my RTX 3080 review, I'll leave a link down in the video description. I highly recommend checking it out as I go through many various benchmarks including games, 3D software, rendering performance, as well as thermals and power usage and all those other details. However, in that video I didn't include ray tracing or DLSS performance as there was already so much data to go through and including it would have made it too long for a single video, so I decided to make a separate one, and this video will be an extension to my RTX 3080 review. Now, when Nvidia first introduced their latest Ampere GeForce RTX 30 series GPUs, one of their biggest selling points was that ray tracing performance and DLSS performance had also improved drastically over the previous generation, aside from traditional rasterization performance. This was mainly because with the Ampere architecture, Nvidia also included second generation RT cores, which are responsible for handling ray tracing, and third generation tensor cores for AI and deep learning capabilities. According to Nvidia, a single Ampere tensor core can give you double the tensor throughput of a Turing tensor core. However, with Ampere-based GeForce graphics cards, there are only 4 tensor cores per SM. As for ray tracing performance, Nvidia claims in their own slides that the individual RT cores can be up to 2 times faster than the RT cores from Turing. But that was mostly seen in content creation and rendering applications like Blender, but programs like those are already well optimized to take full advantage of the GPU, whereas for games, don't expect to see those kinds of performance gains all the time. And you'll be seeing that from the benchmarks as well. Regardless, it was crucial for Nvidia to ensure they increase ray tracing performance over their previous generation GPUs, since the problem with previous gen was that with how heavy the performance tax was with ray tracing enabled, your average frame rate would absolutely tank, making the game in some cases unplayable to the point where you'd have to drop down the resolution or lower other settings, forcing gamers to choose between high visual fidelity content or high FPS. In some cases with ray tracing, you'd really have no other option but to drop down the resolution in order to have playable frame rates, and at that point your overall image quality might be worse than native, so then what's the point? While this wasn't as big of a deal back then because there were only like 3 games out at the time that supported ray tracing, it's a different story now, with many games now having support for the technology, as well as highly anticipated titles coming out like Cyberpunk. AMD is also jumping on the ray tracing train with their GPUs and next-gen consoles, so ray tracing isn't going anywhere. It's definitely the way of the future in terms of how games will be rendered, and you can bet you'll be seeing a lot more games come out that will have support for it. With Ampere and the RTX 30 series, Nvidia is telling gamers now you can have the best of both worlds, where you can enjoy high fidelity content with RTX on and maintain a high smooth frame rate. There will of course be a performance penalty, but it should be somewhat alleviated due to the better performing RT cores. At least that's what Nvidia says, but we'll validate this in just a moment as we go over the benchmarks. Now, before we get into the benchmarks, there are a few things we need to go over, such as GPU specs, test system specs, and testing methodology. To start off, let's go over the relevant specs for the RTX 3080. We went over all of these specs in the 3080 review, so I'm not going to go over everything. As a refresher, the MSI RTX 3080 Gaming X Trio has 8,704 CUDA cores, 272 texture mapping units, 96 ROPs, 68 RT cores, and 272 tensor cores, with a 10GB memory buffer with the new fast GDDR6X modules that run at 19 gigabits per second. The 2080 Super has 3,072 CUDA cores with 192 texture mapping units, 64 ROPs, 48 RT cores, and 384 tensor cores. The 2080 Super has an 8GB memory buffer with GDDR6 modules that run at 15.5 gigabits per second. Both of these GPUs run at around 1900 to 2000 MHz out of the box. I haven't overclocked them or anything for this test, we're just running stock configurations here. Let's move on to the test system specifications that we'll be using to conduct these benchmarks. For the CPU, we've got an AMD Ryzen 7 3800 XT, cooled by a Corsair H115i Pro XT 280mm all-in-one liquid cooler. For the RAM, we've got 16GB of G.Skill Trident-Z memory running at 3600 MHz with CL15 timings. The motherboard is an MSI MEG X570 Unify. For our storage, we've got a 2TB Samsung 970 EVO Plus NVMe SSD. Powering the entire system is an EVGA G3 1000W 80 Plus Gold certified power supply. As for the operating system, we're running Windows 10 Pro with the 2004 update. In regards to the GPU drivers, I'm using Nvidia's Game Ready driver package 456.71. For the games, we're going to be taking a look at 8 different titles which have support for Nvidia's RTX features. All the games were tested at a resolution of 3840 by 2160 or 4K with ultra or very high settings. For each game, there were 4 benchmark runs conducted, if possible, because not every game supports both DLSS and ray tracing, as you'll see. The first run was with no RTX features enabled. We're talking about a native or vanilla experience. The second run was with DLSS enabled, and if the game offered specific DLSS settings, then I picked the performance mode, as this feature is best used to boost frame rate while preserving or boosting image quality. The third run was with just ray tracing enabled, and the highest ray tracing preset was selected. The fourth run was with both DLSS and ray tracing enabled together. By doing these separate benchmark runs, it allows us to see what kind of impacts each of these features can have on the game's performance, and then finally allows us to see what the game's performance will be like with both features enabled together. This will allow us a good outlook on how the performance is relative to just the native experience with no RTX features. And last, this will also demonstrate how each GPU performs in regards to the features, like will the 3080 see a less performance hit with ray tracing on, or will the 2080 Super benefit less from DLSS, etc. With all that aside, it's time we jumped into our benchmarks, and starting us off, we've got a synthetic benchmark from 3DMark. This is their Port Royal benchmark, which utilizes real-time ray tracing effects and supports Nvidia's deep learning super sampling technology as well. It's a good benchmark to see how well a GPU performs with these kinds of visual effects. In this benchmark, the RTX 3080 is a whopping 62% faster than the 2080 Super, scoring 11,536. Now, they also have released 2 other tests based off this benchmark, which measure DirectX ray tracing performance and DLSS performance, showcasing the average FPS achieved. For the DXR test, the RTX 3080 averages 48 FPS and the 2080 Super gets 22 FPS, a massive 218 advantage. Now for the DLSS test, we can see that with no DLSS enabled, the 3080 gets 54 FPS and the 2080 Super gets 32. Then with DLSS on, we see the 3080 boost its performance to 119 FPS, an increase of 220%, and the 2080 Super boosts its frame rate by an even bigger margin at 240%. So that was interesting to see, but I guess with DLSS, you can only boost your average FPS so much until you run into some other limitations elsewhere. Now for our first game, we've got Shadow of the Tomb Raider, a beautiful third-person action-adventure title. This game was actually one of the first few titles back in 2018 to support ray tracing and Nvidia's DLSS, so it only made sense to also include this one to see how much things have improved with what was a first-gen RTX title on a second-generation RTX GPU. As I go over the benchmarks, I won't be focusing too much on the differences from the non-RTX figures, as I already did that in my 16-game benchmark from the RTX 3080 review. In this game, with DLSS enabled, both GPUs do see a significant performance uplift. It's actually the same 14 FPS increase, while percentage-wise, that may appear to be a higher margin on the 2080 Super. So I was a bit surprised to see that and was expecting a bit higher performance with DLSS from the 3080. Still, this game already performs decently well on the 3080, so I'd recommend leaving DLSS off if you're just going to be using the native settings and won't utilize ray tracing. For the 2080 Super though, DLSS sure does come in handy, as it does help make the experience a lot smoother, at 73 FPS average and 68 for the 1% lows, which is better than 59 and 55 respectively. Now when you turn on ray tracing, the performance sure does tank on both GPUs. The 3080 loses almost half its average frame rate at just 45, meanwhile the 2080 Super sees a larger deficit, where with ray tracing turned off, performance was 256% higher, and at 23 FPS average, you're not going to be having a good time here. And while the 3080 is playable, it also wouldn't deliver the most smoothest experience. Now, DLSS does help bring performance back up for both GPUs, where the 3080 is averaging 65 FPS, so just above that 60 FPS mark. Meanwhile, the 2080 Super would give you a console-like experience, if you know what I mean. For our next game, we've got Metro Exodus, and this is a fairly demanding title, as the 3080 at 4K is only able to average about 66 FPS, and the 2080 Super is already struggling at 43 FPS average. With DLSS, performance for the 3080 is just 12% higher, but sadly the 1% lows haven't increased all that much, and there is still quite a bit of variance in FPS. The same goes for the 2080 Super. It seems to have increased its performance by a similar margin. At this point, I'm beginning to wonder why the performance increase on the 3080 isn't higher, with faster third generation tensor cores. I was expecting DLSS to have a more substantial impact on the Ampere based graphics cards. With ray tracing enabled, the 2080 Super is just straight up not playable. The performance drop here is about 47%, meanwhile the 3080 sees a performance drop of around 39%, so not as big of a deficit, but at 40 FPS average and 1% lows at 28, I wouldn't really recommend playing at 4K with just ray tracing enabled. With DLSS, you can enjoy ray tracing on the RTX 3080 in this title, as now we're looking at an increase to 59 FPS average, but the 1% lows aren't as high as where I'd like to see them. With the 2080 Super, I wouldn't even recommend playing this game at 4K with the native configuration, and would tell you to either drop down to 1440p or lower settings, so it's not like ray tracing with DLSS would have made things any better. But overall, I gotta say, performance from the 3rd generation Tensor cores and 2nd generation RT cores isn't as helpful as where I'd like to see them, but so far, we've only seen just 2 games, so let's move on. For our third title, we've got Stranding. This game came out about a year ago, was received fairly well, visually looks fantastic, and on top of that was optimized fairly well too. This game does support Nvidia's DLSS, and it has one of the better implementations I've seen, where with DLSS turned on, the game actually looks better than how it did natively. However, it doesn't support ray tracing, so I don't have any data to share in regards to that. At 4K, the 3080 with native settings is already performing pretty well at 97 FPS average and 85 for the 1% lows. With DLSS, we're now at 149 FPS average and 119 for the 1% lows, so that is a whopping 54% increase for the average frame rate, a boost that would most definitely be noticeable, and that really is excellent as you're getting the benefits of better visual quality while being able to enjoy it with much higher performance. Now, without DLSS, the 3080 is 54% faster than the 2080 Super. However, when comparing the DLSS figures, now the difference is just 38%, which means that the 2080 Super has closed the gap and got a bigger boost in performance relative to what the 3080 got. Strange, didn't Nvidia say that Ampere's tensor throughput was about double that of a Turing tensor core? But I guess them cutting back on the amount of tensor cores may have something to do with it. But so far, I believe we're only seeing the 3080 keep its lead simply because it's the faster card. Next up, we've got Control, and this is another title that's also been known to be pretty demanding, as the 3080 here only manages an average frame rate of just 57 FPS, which is 60% faster than the 2080 Super using the native settings, and the 2080 Super in that regard is also struggling at 35 FPS average and 20 for the 1% lows, meaning you're going to have a very hitchy experience, and while the 3080 is substantially better, it's not ideal. Now with DLSS, the 3080 sees an increase of 68%, whereas the 2080 Super sees an even larger increase at 77%, and again, this is now the 4th title where we've seen the 2080 Super benefiting more from DLSS, and at this point, what I'll say is that I guess games benefit more from the larger amount of tensor cores there are that a GPU has, even if the 3080s supposedly are faster tensor cores. It's funny because usually for CPUs you hear that having higher performance per core is better than having lots of cores, but I guess in this case, as games are generally more GPU bound, more tensor cores are better, and they are showing better scaling here. Now with ray tracing on, the 2080 Super just absolutely chokes and is giving you a slideshow of an experience. It was a pain trying to get through this benchmark run at 12 FPS average. The 3080 on the other hand is, well, not nearly as bad, but its performance is comparable to that of a console. Also here we see that the 2080 Super sees a larger drop in frame rate at 66%, and the 3080 only endures a 38% drop, so the faster RT performance of the 3080 is saving it here. Now with both RTX and DLSS enabled, the 3080 is a whopping 69% faster than the 2080 Super with the same settings, where it's at least getting 61 FPS average, so it should be smooth enough for a title like this while giving you all that eye candy. What I will say though is that if you plan on playing at 4K with the 3080 and want to enjoy ray tracing, then having DLSS enabled is a must. I am glad DLSS was also introduced at the same time as real-time ray tracing was, because in games it's really the only way you can enjoy DXR, as it's so performance tax heavy. The two really go hand in hand. Next up, we've got Bright Memory, and this game probably went under the radar for a lot of people. I actually did a performance overview of this game a while ago, back when it was still in early access. It's a pretty intriguing game to say the least, not too big on the story, but visually looks pretty good. Gameplay was also kind of fun. It felt like a mixture of Doom and Remedy Games' Control or Quantum Break. Performance-wise, the game is a bit of a mixed bag. At 4K, the 3080 is averaging about 107 frames per second, which isn't bad, and the 2080 Super is also able to average 69 FPS, but the frame times weren't as consistent, so it wasn't as smooth as the average frame rate implied. This game does also support both DLSS and ray tracing, and with RTX on, the game definitely does get a nice bump in visual fidelity. With DLSS, the 3080's potential can't be known for sure, as this game unfortunately does have a hard FPS cap at 120, so we're basically maxed out here. Whereas for the 2080 Super, we see a substantial jump in performance, a whopping 62% increase, where it's now basically delivering virtually the same experience as the 3080. With only ray tracing enabled, here we can again see just how heavy it is on performance, where the 3080 sees a 62% drop and the 2080 Super is brought to its knees at 26 FPS average, although that is the same margin as we saw with the 3080. So in this title, we're seeing the Ampere based GPU not showing any benefits of those faster second Gen RT cores, as the margins seen here with ray tracing enabled are the same as what we saw with the native settings. But I'll give it the benefit of the doubt because this game isn't optimized all that well either. Finally, adding DLSS into the mix helps and bumps up performance a bit, so now we can have a playable experience with either GPU, with the 3080 here being 37% faster. Not as fast as when we're comparing the native settings, but still fast enough to the point where you'd have a noticeable improvement in performance. Alright, moving on, and we have Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2019, and this game brought me back into the COD scene. It definitely reminded me of those good old days from Modern Warfare 2, and then with the addition of Warzone, I'm sure the Call of Duty franchise saw a huge uptick in player count it's had in a very long time. Now this game in particular ran pretty well with the settings maxed out on previous gen hardware, where at 4K the 2080 Super averaged about 56 FPS, and the newer RTX 3080 is 59% faster at 89 FPS average. Although this is the type of game where most players would be lowering settings to get the most performance, as is always the case with competitive FPS titles. I wish this game had DLSS support, but unfortunately it does not and only supports ray tracing. However, this is one of the better titles when it comes to ray tracing performance, as with real-time ray tracing enabled, the performance drops aren't as severe as we had seen with other titles, where the 2080 only sees a 16% drop in average FPS and the 3080 has a 18% deficit, so roughly the same margins, and when we compare the averages, the 3080 is 55% faster than the 2080 Super with RTX on. Nevertheless, at 73 FPS average and 57 for the 1% lows, you can play this title at 4K with everything maxed out, with ray tracing turned on, and still have a decent time with the 3080. Up next is the recently released Watch Dogs Legion. With CD Projekt Red's Cyberpunk being delayed again for what was the fourth time, this allowed Ubisoft to take the spotlight momentarily with their title. Although the attention that this game got from the get-go in regards to performance was pretty negative, and rightfully so, you can even see that just with native settings, no RTX, the 3080 at 4K only manages a mere 53 FPS average and gets 45 for the 1% lows, and the 2080 Super is in that console territory with its 33 FPS average, so a difference of 61%. Then with DLSS enabled, we see the 3080 maintain performance at where you'd expect it to be, running at 80 FPS average, which is a 55% boost, and the 2080 Super also sees a 64% increase, so another title where we see faster DLSS margins on the older Turing GPU, and the difference is now down to 48%. With ray tracing enabled, the 2080 Super is pretty much just choking at this point, where we're seeing the same kind of behavior as we did with Control. At 15 FPS average, this is just straight up unplayable, a performance drop of 54%. However, the 3080 also isn't doing too well here either at 28 FPS average and 22 FPS for the 1% lows, so that's also in unplayable territory. Doesn't matter if the drop here it was a bit lower at 47%, we definitely need DLSS here. So with DLSS enabled, now we're actually seeing higher performance on the 3080 than we did with native settings, where we're looking at an increase of 13% at 60 FPS average, and our 1% lows are also higher by the same margin. When compared to the performance from the 2080 Super, the margins are also larger than what we saw with the native settings. It increased to a whopping 76%. Very interesting results, as most of the time we'd be looking at smaller or the same margins at best. The last game on our list is Wolfenstein Youngblood. This game runs on the id Tech 6 game engine, the same engine as Doom 2016, using the Vulkan API. Doom Eternal runs on the newer id Tech 7 engine, although performance here is absolutely great, as you'd expect from this engine. If you've ever played Doom 2016, it ran very well on all kinds of hardware. You didn't necessarily need a top-tier graphics card in order to get high frames. At the native settings, both GPUs at 4K are putting up great figures, where the 3080 gets 142 FPS average and the 2080 Super gets 97 FPS. A 46% difference, but smooth performance can be expected from both GPUs. With DLSS, performance substantially is boosted for both of them, where the 3080 here sees a 47% increase, where now it's at 209 FPS average at 4K, which is just crazy. And the 2080 Super also sees a larger margin at 55%, where now it's able to maintain 151 FPS average, and now the gap between the two GPUs is just 38%. With just ray tracing enabled, performance is still pretty good for the 3080, where it's able to average 85 FPS average, a 40% delta, and 73 FPS for the 1% lows. The same can't be said for the 2080 Super. Here it's only getting 50 FPS average, so it sees a larger decrease in performance at 48%. With DLSS and ray tracing together, we're now back at seeing exceptional performance from both GPUs, and in fact, because the DLSS implementation was so good in this game, performance is considerably higher on both GPUs when compared to the native settings. A 10% improvement for the average frame rate and 1% lows from the 3080, and in this setup, the 3080 is 53% faster than the 2080 Super. Nonetheless, it's worth mentioning that 102 FPS average and 90 for the 2080 Super also isn't bad. That's quite good. So there you guys have it, the second generation RTX performance reviewed for the RTX 3080. Overall, if I'm to give you guys my honest opinion, I feel like performance is a mixed bag. When it came to DLSS's performance, there were a lot of times where we saw the 2080 Super see a larger performance uplift compared to the increase the 3080 got, even though it's supposedly using newer third generation tensor cores, which are supposed to be faster. Sure, the amount of tensor cores are less, but I was expecting to see at least some better performance uplifts. The only reason why the lower improvement isn't emphasized as much is because performance at 4K for the 3080 was already decent to begin with, so it doesn't necessarily need to rely on DLSS as much as the 2080 Super would. Now, when it comes to ray tracing performance, we of course did see the opposite when it came to the 3080, and there were larger performance increases noted when compared to the results from the 2080 Super. Although it wasn't anything too dramatic, and in many games performance was still subpar, where it was just playable at best, and then adding DLSS back would alleviate things and bring the experience back to a smooth gameplay. For the most part, it looks like the reason why the 3080 was coming out ahead was simply because it was already the faster card to begin with, and more or less maintained its lead. The performance gaps didn't drastically become large when ray tracing or DLSS were factored in. I guess this is why when reviews for the 3070 came out, it practically matched the 2080 Ti in RTX scenarios. Had the second gen RT cores and third generation tensor cores truly been as fast as Nvidia claimed they would, then we really should have seen larger performance uplifts with these features enabled, but we didn't. And the gaps were very much comparable to the differences we saw with native settings, so I was a bit disappointed to see that. After all the hype of being able to enjoy ray tracing and not having to endure a huge performance hit, I'm still going to be cautiously using it, because if frame rates tank a lot, then forget about it. But if the DLSS implementation is good, as we saw with games like Stranding or Wolfenstein Youngblood, then you can rely on that to help preserve performance a bit and sometimes get a better visual boost. But those are what the results tell us, so it is what it is. It'll be interesting to see what happens when we throw AMD into the mix. Obviously, we don't know when AMD's answer to DLSS will come out, but we should be able to see how they stack up against Nvidia's Ampere and Turing-based GeForce graphics cards in ray tracing, so that'll be something worth checking out if I can get my hands on one, that is. Also, we still potentially have some other GPUs coming from Nvidia in the near future or maybe a few months down the road, so this is a topic I'll probably revisit. But until then, at least we have some data and knowledge established here. I hope you guys found this video to be informative and helpful. Let me know your thoughts down below. Check out the video description on ways to support the channel and for my other videos. If you guys are interested in more content like this, then make sure you subscribe. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you guys in the next one.